Bob Grupp. I'm host and director of StratCommWorld, our annual conference on strategic communications that will next be on May 24th and 25th, 2021 at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. Welcome to our podcast. This is one in a series of podcasts and webinars that we're featuring speakers from our annual conference. And today we're pleased to welcome Dr. Carmen Simon. Dr. Simon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me and welcome everyone.
Carmen brings unique experience to the field of strategic communication, and that's why we invited her to speak at our conference, StratCommWorld. She is a cognitive neuroscientist who has studied techniques for creating memorable messages that are easy to process, hard to forget, and impossible to ignore using the latest in brain science. Carmen is the founder of an agency called MEMSI, and her most recent book is titled Impossible to Ignore, Create Memorable Content to Influence Decisions. Carmen holds 2 doctorates, one in instructional technology and the other in cognitive psychology, and she teaches at Stanford University. Her expertise in making messages memorable is hugely relevant to us who work in communications at all levels. Eric Schmidt, the former director of Alphabet, the parent company of Google, is famously quoted as saying, "Every 2 days we create as much information as we did from the dawn of civilization until 2003. And I read that content is viewed by nearly 4 billion people who are on the internet. And on average, Google processes more than 40,000 searches every second, which gets to some 3.5 billion a day. It's amazing. You've heard similar statistics, and I'm sure Dr. Simon can share some as well. The one that always scares me as a communicator when I'm writing content or a subject line is that research has shown that we have literally about 3 seconds to grab somebody's attention before they move on. So how do we make ourselves memorable and make our messages and our content memorable? That's what we want to learn today, and I'll turn this over again to Dr. Carmen Simon. Dr. Simon, thanks for joining us.
Thank you. As a cognitive neuroscientist, I'm intrigued by a specific function of the brain, which is how is it that the brain remembers information? And the reason I'm intrigued by this, especially in the business world, is because customers make decisions in your favor, or your internal audiences make decisions in your favor based on what they remember, not on what they forget. So from this angle, memory physically, not even metaphorically, moves the world. So I would like to suggest that for this session, we make memory our mission, because when we do, we automatically influence our persuasive power. And I'm sure that these days, most people are intrigued by the notion of becoming memorable and therefore influential when they communicate at a distance. So let's ask and answer the question, how do we become memorable in a virtual setting? I answer this question from the angle of neuroscience, and my specialty is using EEG technology. I'm sure that you have seen these headsets or caps that you can place on people's scalps. And with those electrodes, and they could be different devices that use these electrodes. Some caps or headsets are more intense than others. We capture people's reaction to stimulation. Sometimes we also use eye tracking devices because we're intrigued by where people pay attention, how quickly. You mentioned the 3 seconds. And sometimes we're noticing that attention is captured even faster than that if you're doing a good job. So as we place the electrodes on people's scalps using these devices, we monitor variables that you see here listed on the screen. Many are self-explanatory. Perhaps some that might capture your attention as you're watching this might be valence and arousal, meaning how much does the brain enjoy the communication that you're showing, whether that communication may be internal or external, and how awake is the brain and alert in order to even pay attention and give you those 3 seconds that you mentioned. Once we capture this data, we create various brain scans, and we have been doing these long enough in order to recognize what are some processes that are happening in the brain, where and with what intensity, and this is how we convert this knowledge, this neuroscientific knowledge, in some practical guidelines that we can share with you and show you how you can become memorable even when you're not in the same room with your audiences. Unfortunately, what we're discovering as we undergo these scientific research is that business people are more forgettable than they are memorable. There's just no easy way of saying it. Well, perhaps not you listening to this, but maybe some people that you know. So we look to find out how we can become indeed memorable, knowing that after 48 hours, your audience's brains will forget 90%, sometimes even more, of the content that you share with them. And of course, who is to blame your audiences? Because would you agree that there's no shortage of information? Bob just shared some statistics around that abundance with you earlier. So of course, the human brain forgets. At least for now, we're presenting to humans. We haven't merged with robots just yet. So memory is fallible, that we know. And what we also know is that we can't really change the reality of today's world. But what if we could change the reality of what our audiences remember, knowing that they will forget the bulk of what you share? What if we could at least control the 10% that they do tend to take away over time and take it a step further and link that 10% to something that you and your audiences find desirable? When I refer to that 10% message, by the way, I use that as a metaphorical number because where business content is concerned, it's almost impossible to place a strict statistic as to how much people take away. Sometimes it could be 18%, sometimes it could be 2%. I just finished a research study a few weeks ago where some people remembered zero. So there is that possibility and challenge that we have to face. So let's look at that 10% as a metaphorical number. And for this session, ask how do you control that 10% when you present to your audiences virtually? And there will be 3 practical techniques that I will share for the rest of the session. I'll pause for one moment though. Bob, I'll turn it over to you. Based on what I've said so far, any reactions or points that you might want to make given the bulk of the information that is being forgotten?
Now, one question that occurred to me, which you can address now or later, is the problem of people multitasking too. I mean, how many of us are guilty of watching something on television, looking at our iPhones, and perhaps listening to somebody in the next room say something? And you know, to what degree does that exasperate the problem of remembering content? But it just occurs to me that makes communication complicated as well.
It is true. Multitasking and distractions are 2 of the biggest culprits. And where memory is concerned, that is definitely a challenge that people have to face because as you're communicating more virtually, you are competing with so many elements in people's environments. Right now, even with this presentation, we are competing with a TV, we are competing with the fridge, we are competing with a comfy bed that might be in our environment. Not an easy competition. The good news is this. There's a myth out there that says that attention span is shorter these days. That couldn't be further from the truth. The brain is intact in its ability to pay attention and sustain paying attention. However, what has changed lately is our threshold for stimulation. So in order to compete with multitasking desires and distractions, make sure that your stimulus is abundant enough where we're inviting people to stay focused on what we have to share and not invited to go somewhere else. Sometimes in business content where not that much happens and when the stimulus is not strong enough, it's almost like an invitation to multitask and look elsewhere. So let's see how through these 3 guidelines that we have prepared for you, we can also invite the brain to stay here versus be tempted to do something else or to look in another spot. If we're promising this notion of controlling your 10% and being in charge of a memory that you put in somebody else's brain, the first step is to clarify what you want others to remember. Even when they may be tempted to multitask or they may be distracted, if it's clear to you what they must remember, it's more likely that it is clear to them. If it's nebulous to you, it's more likely that it will be nebulous to them. A lot of people come to us and they say, help us become more memorable. And even though they have that aspiration, it's not that often that people know what they want to be memorable for. And of course, once you find the clarity of that 10% message, repetition is the mother of memory. You'll come back to that same message again and again multiple times. But let's just look at some practical examples. I'm sure that many of you watching this have to deal at some point with some form of presentation. We're using a presentation even for this session. Presentation formats are ubiquitous, which is why I'm using most of the examples here from that space. But perhaps in your field, you might be developing some other content types, such as videos or websites or ebooks. There are many content types out there, but the same principle applies. If you aspire at being memorable, you have to step back and ask, what is the main and the most important message I want people to take away? When there's a lot of abundance, and sometimes we don't judge against abundance, by the way. It is possible to be memorable if you have 50 slides, like in this example, possible to be memorable if you have 10 slides. But the question still stands though, what should people remember after 48 hours? Sometimes people believe that if they have a well-organized agenda, like you see here in this example, then surely that's a good 10% message. And that's not still the case, because are you noticing that as you're looking at these entries here, what we're still missing is one main message that ties all of the other messages together. So one practical guideline as you clarify your 10% is to look and use the word agenda from here on out almost as a cue to step back and ask yourself, what is my 10% message? You will see how we did it here in a before and after example. And of course, you don't have to necessarily always aim for the visual design of it. Sometimes all you have to do is start with the courage of facing a blank slide or a blank piece of paper and wonder, what is my main message and what are some supporting points to that message? You can see how some of these examples are highly simple and fairly tactical. And of course, you can increase the design quality of it all. But notice how I'm also mentioning that not only are we coming up with one 10% message, but I'm saying no more than 3 or 4 supporting points. And why is that? Is it because the brain can't remember more than this? It's not because of that, because our brains are capable of remembering many more points. The problem is that there is a challenge in remembering many more points, and I'll demonstrate what I mean by this. As you're presenting to your audiences, and you're hoping that they remember something long-term, and for us, we consider long-term anything that happens after 48 hours because memory needs some consolidation time. You will see that the reason people forget so much is not only because time goes by. This time lapse is not the only culprit to us forgetting. There's something else at stake. And we can demonstrate that easily, and we'll invite our audience here to help us demonstrate this. For the next few screens, I'll ask you to look at my screen and focus on the squares that I'm showing you. And once you focus on the square, tell me where on a color wheel that square belongs. So for instance, right now we only have one square. So Bob, Kara, as you're using the chat box, I think it'll probably be easy for you to identify the number where the color of that square belongs in this one, would you say? Let's see if we have some guesses here in the chat box. Yeah, so Kara is mentioning 12, Erin is going for 10, Bob is going for 11. And if we were to take an average of your responses, it's you're getting fairly close. Now watch these 2 squares, and I'm going to leave them there for just a brief moment. And if I bring back this color wheel, take a quick guess. So I like how now you're providing ranges, because already it may be a little bit more challenging, but notice how you're still on it, and it's not that hard to keep those in mind and find the appropriate location. Notice how I'm increasing the stimulus. So now I'm giving you 4 things to look at. I'll take those away, and now tell me what you think. And the exercise is starting to get a little bit more challenging because, and I like that you're still in it. So you're still providing some options here for us in the chat box, and thank you for those. And as you're seeing the correct locations, notice how you're still in the game, so to speak. Now notice what happens to your brain as I increase the stimulus yet. Now we have 6 elements to look at. And as I leave those on the screen for a moment, and I take them away, and now I ask you, where on the color wheel do those belong? Do you still find it easy to complete that exercise? Let's see if you're still attempting. I conduct this exercise quite often. I like that now the question marks are starting to be in there. Perhaps there's a little bit of frustration settling in. But I admire your tenacity, though. You're still in it. So thank you for your answers here. And here they are if you want to check your accuracy. Sometimes people forget what they typed in. And I don't know if I even dare ask to complete the next step, which is as I increase the stimulus yet. Sometimes when we perform this with larger audiences, there are at least one or two people who are still courageous enough to attempt it and type some answers in. Sometimes people go on the fun side and they will type something like somewhere between 1 and 14 because they know they can't go wrong with that. And you don't necessarily have to type up that answer. But see, Bob, thank you so much. I like that at least you tried, and Kara and Aaron, you are too kind, and I'm displaying here the correct location. The point that I'm making with this exercise is this, and this is what you will convert into a practical guideline for all of you to take. As you reflect on your own content, know that your audiences will forget a lot from what you say, not just as a function of time lapse, but also as a function of volume. The moment that I have increased here the number of elements, so we went from 4 to 6 to 8, your memory precision has gone down. And memory precision is a very critical factor for you to reflect on, because if you're operating in a highly competitive space, at some point, you will want to be in charge not only of memory that you put in other people's brains, but also be in charge of the precision of that memory so that people can have it easy to, can find it easy to distinguish between you and the competition. This is why I'm advocating one main message, one main 10% message, and no more than 3 or 4 supporting points, because after that, precision keeps going down. And of course, you can design those in a fancier way or in a simple way, as you're seeing some of these examples. But for the next project that you have, dare to have the clarity of the 10% message and no more than 3 or 4 supporting points, and that will put you in charge of a memory that you place in somebody else's brain, and also differentiate you from somebody else. Bob and Kara and Aaron, I'll stop here for a moment. If you have any reactions or reflections based on what I've covered so far, please bring those along. And Bob, you're on mute, so if you unmute yourself, we can probably hear you.
Thank you. Yeah, I love that exercise. It really quickly illustrates how difficult it is to remember 4, 5, 6 things at once. Earlier, I have a question. Earlier, you mentioned the role of visual design, and I'm not an artist, but to me, I've always enjoyed good visual design, and to me, it can be such a visual aid, and I assume to memory. You know, to what extent is visual design important? I want to ask. You know, color, action, emotion. In help, you know, I think of a red heart. The color red is memorable, can be either good or bad emotion, but it tends to be very memorable. And a red heart, to what extent is visual design and those colors, does that assist in memory?
I'm smiling for multiple reasons. One, because we're using red very purposefully here in this design, because we know that unlike other colors, the red is something that we can actually study physiologically speaking and show how it can have an impact on your heartbeat and on your breathing, unlike many other colors. So red is indeed a color that has guts, and when you can use it purposefully, then definitely do. But I'm also smiling because I couldn't have asked for a better transition into the next section, and we haven't even practiced this, because you're asking a very profound question, which is, in an area where as communicators we're not even in the same room, how can you, the virtual communicator, be in charge of where the eyes go next? I'm a big proponent. I'm so glad that you asked that question earlier around multitasking and distractions, that it's in your hands to choreograph where your virtual attention is looking. And visual design, as you're asking, can definitely help us do just that. Because for the virtual communicator in the future, the success of that virtual communication and the memorability of it will rely on where your audience's focus goes. And why is this critical? Because if you can control focus through some design elements that we will see in a moment, then you're likely to have more attention. If you're likely to have more attention, you're likely to build memories, because attention is a precursor to memory. So let's look at exactly what Bob just asked about, which is the use of color. With the exception of red, I'm not necessarily advocating the use of any other specific colors, although we do see in some neuroscientific studies that a very dark and ugly orange and yellow will not do you any favors. So assuming that you're excluding those, you're using some red every so often purposefully. What I'm mentioning next is the use of some colors, regardless of which ones they are, at the expense of other colors. Like notice this example I'm showing here on the screen. It's a very complex screen. And I'm sure that many of you watching this come from fields that are highly technical, highly complex. And from a neuroscientific perspective, I like to not advocate the principle simplify your complexity, because it's highly unrealistic. And from the brain's perspective, where memory is concerned, simplicity is not always the answer. I'm advocating rather managing complexity well. And one way to manage that complexity well and control where people are looking is through the use of color at the absence of everything else. So notice that even though not in the same room, I can control where you're looking simply because I'm using a color purposefully and everything else is grayed out. I'm hoping that after this session, graying things out will start becoming your friend. It's an effect that you can use in any slideware program or in any other program that you're creating, because presentations may not be the only thing that you're communicating with. But you are in charge of where people may look by using color, by using size. For instance, right now as I switched the screen, I know exactly where your eyes went, simply because something is indeed larger. Even as you're looking at my screen right now, this may not be the most amazing slide you've ever seen, but if I really want to prompt you to look, I can simply draw your eyes through the use of size. And know that you don't always have to make something large. I'm using size purposefully because sometimes if something is big, making something small will in fact draw your attention. Even in a slide like this, let's just say that there was one element that I really want you to pay attention to. I can take advantage of the use of size. And of course, there's always animation, which in visual design, it's a big deal. It must become an even bigger deal yet as you're communicating virtually, because know that even right now, we're not in the same room. I know where you're looking next, and I know where you're looking next simply because some elements do move. And there's a fourth technique that you can use. And by the way, as you're combining all of these, we're coming to you with these guidelines based on the neuroscience studies that we have conducted, sometimes not only with the EEG, but remember the eye tracking devices that I mentioned. As we are having people use the eye tracking on a slide like this, notice how scattered the attention is. The red spots show indeed some focused points, but the rest is just everywhere. So in addition to color, size, and animation, I'm advocating that every so often when it's practical and realistic to reduce the amount of elements that you're seeing on a slide, because notice when you have fewer elements and more compacted in terms of placement, and this is what Bob was alluding through design, do you see how much more of economy of attention we have in a screen like this or in a screen like that? So consider reducing some information, because notice right now, even though we're thousands of miles apart, I know where you're looking, and with a quick click, I know where you're looking next. And the only reason I can afford to do something like this is because of the use of reducing some information. Even a screen like this, not the most amazing slide, and even though it's technical, the reason why I can still control focus is because I have reduced some information and there's not a whole lot to process at the same time. So if we had to summarize these techniques, as you control your audience's focus and you use some design capabilities, even though you may not be a graphic artist, have the courage to give up some information when it's practical, use size, whether it's large or small, use color and use animation, and that's how you can be in charge of where the brain is looking. And if you know where people are looking, you're more likely to control their attention. And if you control attention, you're more likely to impact what they remember first. And I have to make a very important statement next, because controlling the physical properties of a stimulus through design, such as color, size, animation, amount of information, is a bottom-up way of controlling where people are looking. And those are the physical properties of a stimulus. That's not the only way. I want us to be very humbled by the fact that people will still know where to pay attention where your communication is concerned, given some top-down characteristics. For example, if we look at people's goals, if we look at the knowledge that they have, if we look at the expectations that they have as they come to your sessions, those too will impact where people look next. So be very cognizant of the fact that at any given point, you might have to merge perception, which is those physical properties, with cognition, which is those elements that you see at the bottom. So the good news is that you don't always have to try so hard with design elements. If you indeed not just know your audience, because I'm sure you've heard that principle 1,000 times, but rather know your audience's goals, their knowledge, and their expectations. And I'll briefly show what this means. Let's just say that all of you coming to the session had a specific goal. For this example, I'm going to give you a goal. So for my audience here today, please look at the two pictures and tell me if you can identify a symbol that is the same in both pictures. There's only one symbol that repeats. Can you guess which one that is? And I'll be silent for a moment, because this on the surface may seem like an easy exercise, but notice how it takes you a bit to look through these elements. And it's okay if it takes you a while. I'll leave you to it for a few more seconds. And don't feel bad if you don't find it, because it's not an easy exercise. In larger audiences, quite often we get a person who will identify it. But I like the genuine responses that we're getting in here. So in fact, since this will be broadcast, and since we don't have an answer yet, I'll actually not reveal this, just so the rest of the audience gets the joy of getting it. I'll share with the rest of the group outside of this recording, so you have fun finding it. There is one that does repeat, and the purpose of this exercise is this. If, let's just say that we've been talking for a while and you've been watching some screens and some slides, and that's okay, and perhaps at some point you may have been tempted to look at your phone, or something may have happened in the room. There's the multitasking, there are the distractions. But the moment that you have a goal, do you see how your attention instantly becomes sharper? And this can translate in the way that you're communicating with your own audiences virtually, because if you know the goal that they have as they come and attend your communication, regardless of what that communication is, it could be presentations like this or something else. If you know their goals, their attention is already sharper. It doesn't matter how much abundance you have in that communication. And it is the same for knowledge. If people already have some knowledge of your content, that sharpens their focus. For instance, I was reading about this study where people were looking at the amount of accidents between cars and motorcyclists. And what they were discovering is that a car driver was more likely to run over a motorcyclist if they had never ridden a motorcycle before. See, the moment that you have the knowledge or the expertise in some field, that's where your attention becomes sharper. If you're a tennis player, for instance, I am one and not a very good one, but if you ever wonder how is it that a pro tennis player can ever return 150 plus, I think is the record, mile-an-hour serve, it's because they know exactly where to look at their opponent. They will look at how the hips are turned. They will look at some other elements that give them important information, whereas a novice like me might look at the way that the arm is turned, may look at the racket, and those elements tell you absolutely nothing. So an expert will know where to look. So if you know your audience from the angle of the knowledge and the expertise that they bring to the table, even a busy screen like this, as you're seeing right now, or a busy deck like this, you can get away much more so just because expertise sharpens your focus. And that third element of looking at audiences' expectations, the moment that you have some expectations, your focus is also sharper. Like, for example, where would you rather be a pedestrian? Would you rather be a pedestrian in London where car drivers expect pedestrians? Or would you rather be a pedestrian somewhere near us here in San Francisco, where in some regions, car drivers will hardly ever expect pedestrians or motorcyclists? So the moment that you know the brain's expectations, you can trust that it will know where to look. This is why highly complex and technical screens like these will be more acceptable in terms of attracting attention and sustaining it, simply because experts have a much sharper focus. I'll stop here for a moment, Bob. I'll turn it over to you. As you're listening to this combination of perception and cognition, any reactions or thoughts you might have?
Well, this is fascinating. And I wanted to stay with that idea a moment ago of animation. And I think of action. And I also think of emotion. And for corporate audiences in particular, corporate communicators, but it's true in government, the military, public affairs colleagues, introducing action and emotion into our messaging, particularly in presentations, is sometimes difficult. You know, I think of one example I experienced personally. In the town I live in, our high school graduates were robbed of their normal graduation ceremony because of COVID-19 this year. And what the community did was post pictures of the graduates on posters on lamp poles in the downtown business district. And on a warm Sunday afternoon, had a parade through town where the graduates were sitting in a convertible, sitting in a car with balloons. Everybody could wave and clap and cheer. It was highly emotive. It was action oriented. And I had to chuckle on Facebook. The Facebook reaction, if I saw it once, I saw it 20 times. This was so much more fun than sitting in a high school gymnasium for 90 minutes listening to boring presentations. We could see people, we could cheer. I think how important animation, action, and emotion, to the extent that we as corporate communicators can introduce that, makes messaging more memorable.
It is so true, and I'm so glad that you're mentioning this and you're making these remarks, because quite often business content leaves us flat. And what we're recognizing in our neuroscientific studies is when we use the EEG cap that you saw a picture of, quite often on the more performant caps, we sacrifice one of the ports in favor of an ECG cable, that's an electrocardiogram, because we want to know whether people are indeed reacting to the content that you have created. And it's unfortunate to notice something similar to what you're remarking, which is business content quite often doesn't drive that emotion. And this is a perfect transition into the last segment, which is how do we prime the brain with something that's a bit more intense so that people are indeed awake and alert to a moment that is critical, just as critical as celebrating that graduation that you mentioned. This priming the brain principle is not that widely addressed where business content is concerned, and it must. And why is that? Because priming means that with one segment, you have the ability to impact how the next segment is being viewed and how the next segment is being viewed after that. Even as you're listening to Bob explain the sequence in which some things happen, first you're posting some pictures, and then you're inviting the audience to do this, and then some people are doing this other thing. Every single element has the potential, if you treat it carefully, to impact how the brain reacts next. If we return to the world of business communication, in this case, this was still a corporate presentation, but it could be any other kind of stimulus. Let's just say these are paragraphs in a blog that you're writing or some segments in a website. Let's just say that given this fairly bland content that you're looking at here, as a communicator and researcher, I would be curious to know if people are remembering something from slides 5, 13, 17, and 26. And given the fact that the content is fairly dull and at some point complex and quite technical, it's my responsibility to make sure that before those moments I consider critical, I can do something extra and I can amp the emotional aspect of it as Bob is suggesting. So notice how I'm purposefully including some extra strong stimulants, so to speak, right before those important moments. And as we do, and we monitor people's brains in terms of attention and engagement, what we're noticing is that those variables are higher, not only during the more intense and emotionally laden stimuli, but also for 30 seconds, a minute, sometimes even longer after you have embedded those segments. This is why just recently we have created the service that's called Slide Club. It's a service where people receive 5 or 10 slides per month that are a bit more intense. And that's how they prime the brain before a moment that they consider important. I'll show you the 4 slides that have been included in that deck that I just demonstrated. So you see how here you have that extra animation that Bob mentioned. In here, not only you have some subtle animation, but notice how you have a slight element of surprise. And what is surprise but a stronger emotion? We are using this slide in a presentation on cybersecurity. And the moment that you detect that segment that perhaps you did not expect, you react with an extra emotion. Same in here, the moment that you have that slight eureka effect, the emotion settles in, and when we have a stronger emotion, we have a stronger electrochemical signal in the brain. As a result, you can impact better what people remember. The same in here, everybody's talking about disruption. And as the slide reveals itself and you give the audience the joy of getting it, because of the extra emotion, the brain is more likely to be alert and awake to the next segment. I'm a big proponent of this notion of priming the brain with a stronger emotion because in their normal lives, people are used to seeing a lot of extra stimulation as they're watching TV, as Bob mentioned, as they're using the social media app. There's so much intensity in those segments. And when they come back to business communication, especially if you're in a B2B space, there things are fairly bland and devoid of emotion. We mentioned early in the session that attention span is not shorter. However, what has changed is our threshold for stimulation. People are used to watching this, and in business contexts, we are giving them that. So no wonder that we're almost inviting them to multitask and succumb to distractions. So this is why, as you pick your critical moments, perhaps it could even be your 10% messages right before those, consider priming the brain with something that is more intense. And don't overdo the effect. Obviously, too many of these will lose their luster because after a while, the brain habituates very quickly even to intense stimulation. But overall, if you dare to prime, you'll notice that you get the brain to understand the concept faster, easier. You'll get extra attention and engagement. It's because of that that you get extra memories. And it's because of that that you get the extra decision. So priming the brain is the third technique that I know will help you control what audiences remember from your presentations next. I'll pause here for a moment. Bob, I'll turn it back to you to see if we have any reactions.
I apologize. The phone's ringing in the background. We'll stop in just a moment. I wanted to ask about something else, and that is the importance of humanizing our communication. You know, one of the benefits, I believe, of the communications we've had during the pandemic this year on Zoom and webinars and chat rooms is that it really humanized people, whether it was a child in the background or a spouse coming into the picture or seeing people communicate in their own homes or home offices. It makes us more authentic. And I wonder if you would agree, and I wonder the degree to which you believe that this authenticity and humanizing ourselves when we communicate can make messages more memorable as well.
This is a very profound statement that you're making because it's indeed very useful when communication becomes more human, because the moment that you have a human context, you instantly have an extra emotion. And we just agreed that quite often business content is devoid of emotions, so that can be helpful. The key phrase that you mentioned, however, is the degree of it. Because anything, just like with the priming, if it's done, if you have too little of it, then it's detrimental. There is such a thing as too much of it, at which point it can become detrimental. So let's just consider human context to be more authentic. When it comes to authentic, you might remember the advice that you have heard, which is be yourself. And opening up our context to others is indeed being yourself. But then perhaps you also remember your mother telling you to be your best self. So now perhaps we're cleaning up some things here in the background so that things are a bit more sanitized. So we're giving a better version of ourselves. But I would want to add an extra layer on this, which is linked to your notion of the degree of authenticity, which is be your best self in the service of your audiences. So if at some point you have too many elements that are distracting to the audience, and indeed they're still authentic, but you have passed that threshold, then you may be perhaps reaching an unintended effect. So the degree of authenticity and human context is something that is in your hands, and be careful to use it to the extent that is in the service of those that you're presenting to.
I love that notion. I just wrote it down. Be your best self in service of your audiences. That's a great thing to remember. Definitely.
Good. Well, I'm glad that we had the opportunity to review these principles. I guarantee that anytime you apply any or all of them that you see here on the screen, you will indeed have the opportunity to control the 10% that audiences remember. And if you control that percentage, you're more likely to influence where they go next, because people will make decisions in your favor based on what they remember, not on what they forget. It's been fun having you as an audience, and thank you so much for inviting me.
Thank you very much, Carmen. And for everyone in our audience, if you'd like to learn more about Carmen Simon and her expertise, please visit her website at her firm, Memzy, www.memzy.com, MEMZY, there it is. And if you'd like to hear more from Dr. Simon, please check out our conference, StratCommWorld. It's www.stratcom.world, May 24th and 25th next year at the National Press Club in Washington, D.C. We would love to see you there and have you join us. And Dr. Simon, thanks very much. This has been fascinating, and we appreciate your time. Until we meet again.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. Stay in touch.
Thanks. Bye now.
Bye, everyone.